It's an impressive list of sponsors.
It is.
So hello, my name is Lauren Kendall, and we are here to start our panel on Decolonizing Research, a conversation about culturally relevant research practices. Again, my name is Lauren Kendall Brooks. I'm a postdoc at the University of Maryland College Park in the Human Development and Quantitative Methods Department. With us today, we have Dr. Cheryl Talley from Virginia State University, Dr. Linda James Myers from Ohio State University, and Dr. Dawn Edge from the University of Manchester in the UK. So first we're going to have everybody introduce themselves. Dr. Edge, if you can begin, that would be great.
Okay. Oh, hi, it's wonderful to be here. So I am Dawn Edge. I'm a professor of mental health and inclusivity at the University of Manchester. For those of you familiar with the geography of the UK, it's in the north of England. And my work primarily focuses on working with underserved communities in research, but specifically is around Black mental health. And I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about some of the specific programs.
Thank you. Dr. Talley?
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Cheryl Talley. I teach psychology and neuroscience at the Virginia State University. And my research evolved from, I like to say, from rat brains to freshman minds. When I found a aversion to science among my students who have to take my course. And so now I do research on academic interventions looking at affective and motivational factors.
Thank you. And Dr. James Myers?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I'm Linda James Myers. I'm Professor Emerita from the Ohio State University, where I had appointments in Africana Studies, psychology, and psychiatry. And my research interest has been developing a theory of human development grounded in what I call the wisdom tradition of African deep thought. For so long, we have had so many psychological theories addressing many different things, but no theory heretofore that's really used a cultural lens of this wisdom tradition of African deep thought.
Thank you so much. So we are going to get started with some questions. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A in the chat. I will be monitoring. And so let's get started. The first question is, how do you define culturally relevant research? If Dr. Talley, if you can start.
So I love how Dr. James Myers pointed out this need to have theories that are grounded in different traditions and points of view. We all are familiar with the, early psychology textbooks that frame the fathers of psychology. And they come with looking at human behavior with a certain lens. So that's not to be faulted necessarily, but the issue comes when that lens gets universally applied. And so there is, I think the onus on us is to see this cultural underpinning and this cultural lens by which we view human behavior as an absolute necessity in terms of any kind of research on people of color, because we are all influenced by it, sort of like the water we're all swimming in. So to just address the need for it, it's absolutely clear. In my own research, I use the theory created by Margaret Beale Spencer, the phenomenological variant of the ecological systems theory by Bronfenbrenner. And that has created a rich source of study just on the theory alone, not even going into what we actually study. So I think it's absolutely crucial and imperative that we use this cultural lens, at least look for it in whatever research we're designing.
Thank you. And I am also passionate about the PBES theory, so I love it. Dr. Edge, if you can answer the same question, how do you define culturally relevant research?
So I think this is a great question, and I think the real answer, certainly in a UK context, is that it's a work in progress. I think we're not quite there yet. I think certainly when we look at kind of culturally informed approaches to different therapies and so on, it's really clear that we're not sure about a unified framework and a unified approach, and that may not be possible or relevant. But I think really picking up on what Dr. Talley said, I think it's really important to recognize, and I do recognize that, there's a difference between the UK and the US, but certainly in the UK, there is a tendency to equate culture with all things black and brown and the global South. And in a sense, anybody, certainly in the UK context, anybody who's originally from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, that we have culture, but it's as though white people, where we live with the white British people, they don't have culture. So, well, that's rubbish. We all have culture. And I think the other thing is to remember that, and I'm sure I don't have to remind people on the platform, is the historical origins of psychology and its relationship, particularly with race, and how it's informed some of those theories about race and mental health, and who has the cognitive ability, for example, to engage in psychological therapies. There's a lot of talk about Black people weren't sufficiently, evolved to be able to take part in therapy, and how we still see that being played out with lack of access to talking treatments. So I think we have a way to go, but for me, when I'm talking about culturally informed therapy, what I'm looking at, particularly in the UK and Caribbean, African and Caribbean context, and the work I'm doing around psychosis, is to kind of bring to the fore, for those people, the way the system is designed, which is a kind of a one-size-fits-all model, that we need to think about where people have come from. We need to anchor their present in a past and understand how that informs the individual's lived experience, but also the therapeutic dynamics. So certainly in the UK, most of the therapists are white, certainly in psychology, predominantly female, and thinking about what that means in a therapeutic context. So a lot of the work for me is the therapy is one thing, but a lot of it's actually about educating the professionals who are delivering therapy to be able to work cross-culturally. And that means that they've got to own their own culture. They've got to understand their own culture in relation to other people's.
Yeah, and I really love how you talk about how to own your own culture and look into it. One of our members, our Black and Psych members, Livy, mentioned a quote that she heard, which was, "You can look at Black women through the lens of the problem, or the problem through the lens of Black women." And it just really hit me really hard, because I think that so much of the time we spend looking at the problem, or looking at people through the problem and not through their own eyes, which again, takes me back to PBES and why it's important. So Dr. James Myers, if you can answer the same question.
Truly, it's been answered. Actually, the idea of culturally relevant research has to be grounded in acknowledgement of your own cultural lens. All people have culture. All, simply put, a way of life that has particular designs for living and patterns of interpreting reality, and all those things are so essential to any kind of research, because you're bringing those things to the table as you raise your questions, look at methodologies, actually unfold the whole process. So if you're not conscious and cognizant, articulating what your cultural lens is, then you're doing an injustice to whatever question it is that you're claiming to study. And unfortunately, mainstream Western psychology has a penchant for never acknowledging the cultural lens that has been brought. But I think it's essential to good research to make it culturally relevant by, first of all, acknowledging the cultural lens you bring. Second of all, in acknowledging that cultural lens, try to have some kind of this historical grounding in the trajectory of research, particularly in the West, in mainstream Western psychology. It's not true that psychology emerges in the West. We can trace it back to classical African civilization, where we actually talk about seku, the psyche, the soul. And there were actually methodologies and practices engaged in those ancient times of which we have historical record. That can be helpful to us today if we want a really comprehensive, cohesive, and coherent understanding and approach to research. So for me, the cultural research doesn't have so much to do with what the research topic is, but the lens you bring to it, and then conscious, deliberate honesty about the nature of that lens and what assumptions are inherent in that lens. And if you're using the lens of mainstream Western psychology for the most part, except for the one that Lauren said she loved, I don't know it, but then you're probably bringing to the problem your problem. And if you want to really investigate questions around people with whom you're unfamiliar, you really, really, really need to bring to the best of to the best you can their cultural lens. Very true.
It reminds me of my mentor, the late great Dr. Oliver Hill Jr. said that when we do our research, we always bring our own thought processes to it. We bring our own feelings towards it. And we need to do what we can to eliminate that as much as possible, or else the research isn't fair, it isn't unbiased. And as we interpret it through our own lens, we are placing upon our own beliefs on that group of people or that person. So thank you so much. That was amazing answers. Another question, what are the challenges to implementing culturally appropriate research? Have you all seen difficulties with funding, trying to do publications, participants, stuff like that? Dr. James Myers, I'll come back to you again.
Sure. I think the biggest problem that I've encountered with implementing culturally relevant research is getting people to acknowledge the myth of objectivity. They like to pretend that what research we are reading in most of our journals, the highly prized journals, they're all based on the myth of objectivity. And that's a problem because, as we have pointed out already in this conversation, it's impossible, humanly impossible, to be objective, because we always bring our own experiences, exposures, and the meanings made. There's nothing we can do with them. We're going to bring them to our topic, to our subject area. And so getting people to acknowledge that and therefore develop some kind of cultural humility and appreciation for cultural epistemes that may be very different, and that actuality the complete opposite of what they buy into, and to accept their legitimacy is really a big challenge. And of course, that challenge is going to be impacting your funding, your publications. Don't typically have a problem with your participants, though. They get it, and they're so happy to say, oh my God, I'm so happy somebody's really looking at this or addressing this from a way that really makes sense for me. But again, I think the biggest challenge in implementing culturally appropriate research is to create space within the academy, within the discipline, and even transdisciplinary, that allows us to bring a cultural lens that is not dominant in mainstream society. and particularly cultural lenses that have been denigrated due to systemic racism, which carries with it cultural imperialism.
Wow, that cultural humility, that hit me. Dr. Edge, if you can answer the same question.
You know, I'm not sure there's much to add. That's a very comprehensive question. I guess the maybe in answering, I can give an example, like a lived example of how that pans out. So I've mentioned the work that I'm doing at the moment. I'm leading a team of people doing research to develop culturally informed psychological family therapy for people with psychosis from sub-Saharan African and Caribbean backgrounds in the UK. And when I did the initial pilot work for that, and I was applying for funding, we have an internal process, review process, before we submit grants externally. And so I had some feedback from a very, very senior person in my institution who said, this is a really well-written grant. It's an excellent piece of work, but I don't think it will get funded because the topic area is seen as being too niche. This is the word she used, niche. So it's too, you know, yeah. So thankfully I didn't listen to her and went ahead and submitted anyway. But I think it's saying quite a lot about what is seen as being relevant, what is seen as being good quality research, what is then valued within the academy. So a lot of that initial work was actually qualitative research, talking to people, going into communities where this whole thing about really, really high rates of schizophrenia and psychosis. If you're a Black person in the UK, your risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia is about 7 times greater than a white person. And this has been talked about for 60 years. And so, but there are no culturally informed therapies. There are no solutions other than medication. And so when I started talking to people in the communities, having grown up hearing all of this about, well, what are we going to do? And people said, well, we need an alternative. We need something else. We've got some challenges about talking your business, but we're prepared to overcome those to have an alternative to medication. And yet within the system, when you advance this kind of research, the people who fund it and the people who facilitate its funding are going, well, is it really research though? Is it? And then of course, when you, particularly when you do the qualitative stuff, you try to get that published, there are only certain journals where it can get published, as you know, and that hierarchy of research evidence with randomized controlled trials at the top. Qualitative research doesn't even figure, it's not even on the bottom. It's not there. So all of that stuff that you need to actually inform your research by talking to people and then working with them to design research is just seen as it's not regarded. It's not given any value at all, except, as Dr. James Meyer says, for the people with whom we're doing it, because they really get it.
Wow. So much. Dr. Talley.
I mean, this is just such a wonderful, just wonderful answers. And I'm just going to build on the last one by Dr. Edge about the power of the community. So she's absolutely right. And thankfully, she did not stop at that first niche comment. And I think that it's imperative that groups like this, Blacks in Psych, where young professionals begin to arm themselves with the understanding that you will run into people who have this niche argument already before they even read past the abstract. So they've seen your university and they came up with the niche argument already. I've been on many well, not many, let me be humble and be truthful. I've been on some disturbing review panels with the National Science Foundation in which my fellow colleagues really did not know much or at all about Black psychology. And even when the applications, when the proposals were seeking to study them, and they use no reference to the decades of history from Black psychology. I mean, like Journal of Negro Ed, they're not even quoting from. Gosh, it's like, you know, where is our scholarship? And so I think it's absolutely crucial that you not only understand these things, but that you put yourselves in the room, and that you have to arm yourselves to be in that room. And there are ways that you have to go about it. I mean, it's Du Bois all over again. It really, I'm not all over again, like we haven't got over it.
That is so true. And I think that that's something that we always, I can say Dr. Talley was my advisor, so I can say that it was a push for the scholarship, putting it out there and trying to get that information out there is hard. And then it seems to further validate, well, there's no information, so it must not be important. Well, we can't get the information out because it doesn't seem important. It seems very niche. And that's not the case. So we're in the circle and it's hard. Wow. I'll go to one of the questions from one of the attendees. So it says, to Dr. Edge and all the panelists, what do you believe in the consequences of the white belief that white people don't have culture? And I'm going to say my interpretation of the question is white culture being the overarching culture, so we don't necessarily maybe need to look into the culturalist culture, I guess you could say, just because it is, we take it, and everything else is unique, and they are just the majority. Dr. Edge, if you can.
Yeah, so I think I have a slightly different take on it, which I think, and I do, as I say, I'm acknowledging differences between, as well as similarities between the US and the UK. But I think really in the UK, culture is seen as something that is attached to people who are other, who are exotic, who are sometimes deviant. You know, there are all these other groups it's attached to, but it's not the mainstream. So that it's like people say it literally as though they have no culture of their own, because culture is something which is a mechanism for othering other groups of people. And of course, the certainly in looking at the people who I'm working with, service users and their families that I'm working with, the end result of that is that culture across the board is then not seen as being relevant in terms of the kind of psychological processes and the interventions that we're going to develop, and therefore which are informed by the research. So you then get that circle where you just kind of keep on reinforcing more of the mainstream kind of research. And even when it's Black people or Asian people who are trying to do this work, there is a real pushback against doing anything that is not mainstream. Because it's as I said earlier on, it's not seen as being valued, but also it's just seen as being niche, and also, you know, that the science then starts to be questioned. So, and it's not being questioned in kind of looking back at that tradition of scholarship that underpins the argument around culturally informed research. It's informed by a different lens, which says, well, it's not what we do, so it can't be right. And it can't be good science because that's not how we do it.
Wow. Dr. Talley?
Yeah, I think there is a cost to people, to groups of people who perpetuate this otherness because it's not natural. You know, you look across nature, there is no species that is not dependent upon other species, nowhere else except in the minds of human beings. And you can see the cost that has rent upon our planet and ourselves. So it's sort of like it's to the detriment. And truly, when you look at global warming, the consequences of pollution, nobody escapes it. You know, this disregard for each other. We don't, and for nature. And so I think our biggest challenge, and I see this in my students, is wanting to be like that. You know, to take this mindset and I just want a job so I can be a bigger consumer, that and that, I mean, I'm so interested now in Dr. James Myers' work about this deep knowledge, because it was the West that brought us this cognitive only, brain-based, logical way of viewing the world. I mean, we emerged from a group of people that understood that there are other ways of knowing. And I believe my hero, George Washington Carver, brought this to the laboratory. So he brought it to his investigation, those 4:00 a.m. walks in which he was, asking God questions. There is a courage that you need to have to be in science like that. But I think it is our only salvation, because this way we're going, yeah, it's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable.
Wow. Dr. James Myers.
Yeah, it's led humanity to the brink of destruction. We've absolutely polluted the environment. I mean, literally in every way possible. If the science that they were doing and the research, particularly in psychology, was so effective, I wouldn't mind following it, but it's brought us to the brink, humanity to the brink of destruction. Why am I going to follow that? Why am I going to allow you to pretend that you don't have cultural imperialism and hegemony at every level across the National Science Foundation to NI, all of those federally funded using my tax dollars? No, at some point we have to educate our young people to stand up and speak truth to power. Otherwise, we're going to go over the brink just like they are. But in response to the question about whites having no culture, part of the reason they think they have no culture is because they became white when they came to America. It's a part of systemic racism. If they were still French or Swedish or British or Portuguese, they would own their culture. But no, they can't do that in white America and still succeed. They have to come to America and be white. And then when you become white, you really don't have a specific culture. What you have is a white supremacist culture. And of course, nobody wants to call it that. So we'll just say, maybe we have no culture. But one of the things we know about white culture is that it's continually culturally misappropriating other people's cultural ideas, one. And in so doing, they push a hegemonic imperialist point of view that they are very resistant to approach with true science. Because true science says, oh, this is what I believe, you believe that. Let's bring our knowledge, the heights of our knowledge to the table, lay them all, the cards all out, and then let's reason together about what makes sense. Have you ever known the National Science Foundation to have such a convening? Or the American Psychological Sciences Association? Or the American Psychological Association? No. Probably the closest we come may be the Council of National Associations of Ethnic Minority Interests, which, by the way, is going to soon be coming out with a publication through the I think it's going to be Humanistic Psychology, Journal of Humanistic Psychology, on alternate cultural paradigms in psychology.
Wow.
Wow. This is so much. Another question that we have from the audience is, how would you like to see racial biases eliminated or significantly reduced within psychological assessments? Dr. Talley.
Wow. Wow. So I have to take on what Dr. James Myers just mentioned about first acknowledging you're white. Well, first acknowledging that you can assess what you say you are assessing. Like, is that a possibility, first of all? So the lack of acknowledgement of the limitations of psychological assessment has not helped us in the I'll say unintended, I'll be generous, unintended consequences of trying to reify something like human intelligence. I mean, just that sentence is so full of meaning. Intelligence, what is it? Reification, putting numbers on it, and then creating a system by which other things are judged because of it. I mean, it's just so broad. So my little answer, my little contribution is to create our own assessment. And in doing that, we acknowledge that there are things, there are factors, there are protective factors and risk. That's what Margaret Beale Spencer says across all human development. And undergirding ourselves and protecting ourselves against racism is a clear example of the resilience of people of the diaspora, of the African diaspora. So it's not a deficit at all. It is a clear case of how strong we are.
Well, yes, that's definitely true. Dr. Edge?
Yeah, so I think absolutely the point about the validity and reliability. Psychologists set such great store, don't they, about the validity and reliability of instruments. And then you begin to use them and you're going, oh, well, this doesn't actually speak to my experience at all. But we'll carry on using them anyway. So it doesn't matter how many times we even people who are well-meaning, and I'm really fascinated by this by some of my colleagues who are, very see themselves as very great scholars, and yet I read published research that acknowledges occasionally that that the instrument that was used hadn't been validated on this population.
Right.
But then they still go on to present the results aproblematically. So the results aren't then evaluated through that lens of saying, but actually this might be complete rubbish because the instruments weren't actually designed to measure this. And that's even if you think that some of these constructs are things that are measurable. Mm. And that those constructs have the same meaning across cultures, which of course we know that they don't. So the whole concept of measurement is fundamentally flawed. But you try and get funding for research that doesn't use some of these validated measures. You try and argue for clinical services that don't use these measures as outcomes. And I think that's a big challenge for us, is to continue to push back against that, to come up with our own measures that are validated, to actually problematize the notions of some of the way these constructs are interpreted or constructed, and the mechanisms by which these things work out. So, we're only now beginning to, well, we've known it forever, but people are only now just beginning to talk about racism as trauma. Only now. How is that even possible? But only now, some of my colleagues are beginning to go, oh, right. Not so far forward as to thinking, okay, so how do we actually think about the mechanism by which racism is actually so integral? Might that be one of the reasons why, if you're a Black person in the UK, your risk of diagnosis of schizophrenia is 7 times greater than a white person? And actually, given what we experience on a day-to-day basis, as somebody that said, it's a wonder we're not all mad. The fact that we're not all crazy means we're doing some good stuff. So maybe we ought to come up with some measures that measure that.
Yeah, that's Dr. James Myers. I see the smile.
That's good stuff. Thank you so much, ladies. I think in response to the question, racial biases reduced in psychological assessment, the challenge is simply kind of trying to roll that back enough so that we begin to get people to look at racial bias. I mean, to look at it in psychological assessment or this or that, the other is all well and good, but let's just look at it for what it is before we try to take another step forward. And in looking at racial bias, we have to begin to examine what are some of the cultural, what is the cultural worldview from which racial bias emerges? First of all, race is a false idea. totally created so that we can begin to assign value and allocate opportunity based on skin color and phenotypic differences that privilege whites and disenfranchise blacks. So if that's what we're talking about in terms of racial bias, and those are the underpinnings of race itself, where can we go in terms of reducing bias in assessment? So until we've taken that step back and help those people who are interested in good science clearly examine the roots of racial bias, then we're not going to get anywhere in terms of reducing it in psychological assessments. But if we can begin to do that, then we stand a chance of reducing it, not only in psychological assessment, but treatment, community development, every aspect across the spectrum of human engagement can really be enhanced if we just take that first step. And we really have to help them understand the fallacy of their epistemological premise, which is knowledge is external. That sets us up for the myth of objectivity bias. And you can know by counting and measuring. What? No. That's why all the journals you read, one thing they'll always say is, well, you know, we attempted this research and we found this, but more research is needed. And it's going to be needed forever as long as our episteme is so frail and invalid. I'm not highly opinionated, am I?
I think it's amazing. I think that kind of leads into another audience question, which was, how do you address reviewers who want to see a white control group in experimental studies? So, Dr. James Myers, are you on a roll, or do you want to?
They want a white control group.
Yes, how do you address reviewers?
I think the key is just to help them hold up that mirrors so they can see what they're asking for.
Yeah, right.
Because a white control group implies implicitly that I am the standard, and you can't even look at yourself unless you look at me too. What the heck? That doesn't even make any sense, since your role in this country, since its inception, hasn't been clean, honest, morally correct, based on any kind of moral compass or ethical standards, and now you want to become included as a control on something I'm hoping to study? No. Maybe we can do this. When you begin to make Black people the control group, after having been trained about Black culture and a worldview that's not your own, then we can begin to think about why it would be important for you to be a part of the study itself. But basically that is just straight up systemic racism, intellectual imperialism, and basically trying to conceptually incarcerate us so we think, oh my God, we can't really do research unless we have to begin to accept as scholars and researchers of the formal educational system of which we've become a part, and the control that has been put on our consciousness to perform in a particular kind of way so we can either move in graduate school, out of graduate school, into a profession. All along the way, they have in place mechanisms to keep us under control and limited. And I do believe that it's now or never. It's now or never. They just elected a president who was a pathological liar. I won't even go into all his diagnoses, but simply say this. And now, no longer in office, 77 million people still follow such a leader. Tell me, mainstream psychology, what's up with that? What's up with that? Come on, let's just quit and be honest and look at the real world. Look at the real world and the world you've created. And then when we decide we don't want a part of that, just give us an ear. That's all we want. Just listen. Just bring us to the table. Let us tell you what we have experienced and what we have seen and what we think, because I think it will be the salvation of humanity.
Yes. Dr. Ed.
Yeah, follow that. Yeah, so I think one of the things that that we do acknowledge and have to acknowledge is that thinking that says white is the norm, and from there everything else deviates. And so definitely with the work that we're doing, we just absolutely push back. Well, it's not even a consideration. So our control groups are ourselves. So our RCT, other Black people, and actually the work that we're doing, one of the really important things about it is in the UK, there is a tendency to homogenize all Black people. So we're all the same. And of course, there is some truth in that. We've all got the same historical origin. But as I've had to point out to people, you know, my family are originally from Jamaica. Well, you know, most of the other Caribbean countries hate the Jamaicans, don't like us, because I think we're all very uppity. We don't. But that aside, you know, we're very different. The food that we eat, so if you go, well, I'm sure those of you who've traveled, you know, if you go to Jamaica, the food that you eat is quite different than if you go to Trinidad, for example, where there's a big South Asian influence. And if you go, it's different again in Barbados. So just to help the people who are working, so moving away from the research to a little bit more to the practice. But in the research, when we're doing the research design and actually testing out this new form of therapy that we're doing, is actually training up the therapists. And part of their training is giving them that basic understanding, because another issue, of course, and you know, we touched on intelligence tests and IQ, but in the UK, history, I guess everywhere else, is so badly taught because it's taught from the position of the colonizers. And therefore, people, you know, there are people with doctorates in the UK who didn't know about the triangular trade, the so-called triangular trade. They had no idea how people ended up, Black people in the UK from the Caribbean, what the story was by which they arrived in the UK. So if you don't get that from the very beginning, and then you're going to compare my experience with that of a white person and have them as a control, for no. That's just flawed in so many ways. Where would you even begin with that?
I have no idea, because
it's just so flawed.
It really is. And it's also been a question, and what I have experienced is, why do I need to know this information? Because it doesn't have anything to do with me. You know, it has, the experience of Black people across the diaspora has nothing to do with me. So why do I need to know it? Whereas Black people across the diaspora are trying to know everything, you know, not just Black people, but all, you know, people of color know their history and everybody else's history as well. And that's just it's not feasible. Dr. Tally.
Yeah, I was just thinking as I was listening to the answers about those flaws, but there's an even deeper flaw that I see, and that was most articulated by your actual advisor, the late Dr. Oliver Hill Jr., who was a scientist of an exemplary caliber, but he was also a very deep contemplative. Mm-hmm. And from that perspective, everything viewed from my body's perspective as real will always be flawed. If I consider myself, and this is the issue with white supremacy, they truly believe that is all they are, is the white body, is the demyelinated skin tone, the phenotype. That is who they are fundamentally. Whereas, you know, you didn't get Harriet Tubman's going and walking into streams, realizing that she was not hearing from a deeper part of herself, acknowledging that there is spirit here, there is nature here, there is something other than just me. You bring this is what humanity is. The blindness on this thing that we call racism, trying to make me like you. See, I refuse to be like you. I refuse to see myself only as this skin, this phenotype, this bone. There will be something when all of this is not here. So with that, I have courage to go into your institutions and present my science, because I don't believe it's just me. I believe that truth is bigger than me, and that I am bringing some truth to you. And that if I don't get it reflected back, no worries. I'll be in silence in my meditation in the morning, and I'll get corrected at that time.
Yes, I definitely. I will. So looking at the time, I'm gonna try to get in at least one more question. So how do you personally handle and persevere through the de-evaluation of your work? Do you choose your battles? Do you just try to decide what is the most important part of my research or my or working with my clients? How do you battle it? How do you battle it? Dr. James Myers.
Well, I'm going with Dr. Talley, what she said. The reality is, I understand who I am, not as an individual form. I'm just here representing. I'm here representing creative life force, source, ancestors, all those energies who required I be here at this time, in this place, speaking truth to power. And so I just do that. And I'm going to get my butt kicked every once in a while, maybe a lot. Maybe people won't want to hear, but then the people I came for, to plant seeds, to leave a path, oh, they get it. They get it. And so I know when my body's gone, my soul will survive. And it's given me great courage, because I have learned, as my ancestors learned, my good isn't in the hands of my slave captor, isn't in the hands of the dean, the chair, the president, NIH, or any of those. My good is within me, because I'm one with the source of all good. And I'll be protected. And whatever they cut off, spirit or woman, make another way, better than I could have ever thought of. So there's another way of being in the world, is what I'm simply trying to say, that gives you courage, that allows you to go forward fearless. We need to begin to be fearless in our pursuits and studies, because we got this. We really do.
That resiliency coming through. Dr. Talley?
I so agree. We are bigger, we are deeper, we are fuller than what is defined in mainstream psychology, which when we look at it from the whole of human evolution, when we first came here on this planet, just think of this little, dot of time now, where we're trying to define it as through this intellectualized, whatever racialized lens. It need not be our truth. It is true to some people. It need not be my most cherished truth of who I am and who humanity is. It need not be that. And so if I'm asking how to destructure this, I would say do careful science. Careful, CAREFULL. Careful, caring for yourself. Because if you bring your true self, just like Dr. James Myers said, your authentic self, your grounded self to this enterprise, then you will contribute no matter what it looks like. So we have to be clear. People have contributed and it did not look like a contribution at the time. We have to have that same kind of courage, that same kind of knowing. And when you wake up knowing that all the ancestors are hailing the fact that you put your feet on the ground, then you can go forth and conquer.
Wow. Dr. Edge?
Wow. All of that again. And I totally agree with that. And I think for me, one of the greatest things that we need to do is to be our authentic self, is to come into that space where we can be our authentic selves, and to do so in a way that it does require courage. You know, it requires courage for me to turn up at my institution looking like this, let me tell you. When I decided to change my hair, there were people who told me that that was not a wise thing to do and that I probably wouldn't be as successful because I didn't have that kind of corporate hairstyle. And, you know, I am the first and only Black woman professor at my institution.
I can just a quick, I meant to say this. I've been doing the research on Black professors in the UK and Black female professors, and the ratio, my mind does not even really comprehend.
It's less than 1% for Black women.
In the entire 19,000 people, less than
19, so there are 20,000 academics at my institution alone, and I am the only Black woman.
Where are you?
Manchester.
Mm.
So that means that when I turn up, that is turning up is enough. It's something. And I remember, you know, my when I first came into the psychology department and subsequently got talking to one of our Black students, and she said, you know, I must tell you, she said, that the day that you walked into that lecture theatre, I couldn't wait to get out, and I ran out the classroom and I rang my mum and I said, Mum, we've got a Black lecturer. And her mum was like, really? And, you know, unfortunately, in lots of places in the UK, that is still the case, where it's a rare thing. Our institution is, I don't know how old Manchester University is, 200 years old, I don't even know. But I am, yeah, it's so for me, turning up,
Right. Yeah.
and bringing myself and, you know, and doing the work that I want to do. So starting doing stuff like I did with perinatal depression amongst Black women because nobody else was doing it. Doing the stuff around schizophrenia because no one else was doing it. And with that, creating the spaces, so James Meyer says, where people who are following you can see that this is now possible. Yeah. So things that they had thought were not possible, they now think, oh. So I now have conversations, calls from other people, from other institutions, saying, you know, one of my students wants to do research on Black mental health, but there is no one in our institution who can appropriately supervise their PhD, their doctorates or clinical psychology doctorate. Would you be willing to be part of their team? And I'm working towards the day when that is no longer a thing.
Yeah.
But for now, the fact that the Black student feels sufficiently empowered to say, I want to study Black people's mental health. I do not want to get to do a project that you want me to do, which means nothing to me. And that there is sufficient humility within those teams and those organizations for people to recognize that they don't have the knowledge, skills, expertise or experience, certainly not the lived experience, and be willing to reach out. And the fact that there may only be a handful of us, but there are a handful of us that they can reach out to. That comes with its own challenges, including burnout, being overstretched because you're everywhere and trying to do lots of stuff. So it's really important then to be connected to your spirit and to be focused and really clear about about the direction that you're moving in and what to say no to. And I'm saying no more now than I've ever done because there's a lot to do and we have to stay focused on the really big picture.
Wow. I wish we had more time for more questions. I keep seeing them come through, but what I would ask is everyone say something, their final thoughts, something to, because this has been so inspiring to me. I am filled and happy, and it's been such a blessing to be able to talk to you all. Dr. Talley, if you can go first.
Sure, I think it's all been said, or I've said all I needed to say in terms of hoping that the students on this call and that your organization in general promote this self-care. It is so important that we realize what we're walking into and that we are equipped with that inner fortitude that will not come from reading books. And I don't want you to have to go through years and years of not having this strength and being buffered about by other people and then come into it, you know, bruised and broken, when I wish someone had told me at the beginning this is a source of strength for you. Go now and use this.
Yeah.
And so I hope that this organization takes on that gauntlet, because you have a rich tradition. I mean, who better than the African American tradition to show you all the ways in which people have been resilient by going deep.
Yes. Dr. Edge.
Yeah, so finding that truth within and the source within, but I think also the interconnectedness. You know, I'm so absolutely thrilled that you've reached across the pond to invite me to be part of the panel, because that connection between us, you know, the sisterhood and the brotherhood and the things that have kind of sustained us, even when we didn't have our own biological families, that connectedness is really important. And I think understanding that self-care is a radical act. It's radical. It's a political act, especially for Black women, where we often are doing so much caring for families. We're doing stuff in churches and the community, and we're often the person that we think of last. And I think putting ourselves first, you know, that, you know, as they do when they do that display on the airplane, first fit your own mask, look after yourself first, make sure that you are well and whole, because then you have stuff to give other people. So get radical self-care.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. James Myers.
Yes, I certainly agree with what's been said so far, but I think what comes to mind and the thought I'd like to leave is Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Not a lack of money, not a lack of research, not a lack of knowledge. So I would like to leave with folks the idea of being a knowledge bearer. And if you don't want to be responsible to say certain kinds of things to your faculty or to institution, tell them to bring someone in to help them deal with this pandemic of systemic racism, because it's killing us. And if you're a person of any kind of character, if you're a person who has any moral compass, any ethical standards, any spiritual acumen, you are obligated to do the right thing at some point. And if nothing else, the right thing is to gain the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding you need to be helpful to the upliftment of humanity.
Wow. Thank you all so much. I think that this panel has been a true embodiment of what Black and Psych wants to do, what we're trying to do, what we hope to do. We are in it for a good time and a long time. So I am glad that everyone was able to participate. Again, I am honored to have been able to speak with you all. And again, it will be recorded. This was recorded, so we will be putting it on YouTube for people that had to leave. But again, thank you all so much. It was such an honor, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for being an excellent chair.
Good seeing you all.
Happy to meet you, Dr. James Myers.
It's been a pleasure meeting you all.
Likewise.